Elena Parker adjusted her gloves. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor steady in the background. She glanced at the young mother lying on the delivery bed. Her face etched with both pain and anticipation. Beside her, a man paced the room, tall, with an angular face and an uneasy energy radiating from him. Darren. Calm down. Abigail. His wife. Whispered. Her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Darren's cold blue eyes landed on Elena. And something dark flickered across his face. He leaned closer to the attending doctor. His voice a sharp whisper, but loud enough for Elena to catch the words. No colored people. I don't want her touching my kid. Elena froze for a second, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. The doctor shifted uncomfortably but nodded, issuing a quiet command, Elena. Step outside. I'll handle this. Her heart tightened. But she complied. The rule was clear, follow orders. Keep calm. And avoid confrontation. She closed the door behind her. Her breath shallow with frustration. Hours later, Elena heard the code blue alarm from down the hallway. The baby was in distress. She rushed toward the room, instincts kicking in, but stopped short. The order was still fresh in her mind, don't touch that baby. She hesitated, helpless, as another nurse scrambled inside. Moments later, the flatline beep of the heart monitor filled the air. The baby was gone. Elena sat at her kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. Her hands cradled a cup of coffee, but the warmth couldn't chase away the cold weight settling in her chest. The night's events played on a loop in her mind, the baby's small body, the panicked cries of the mother, and Darren's venomous glare. Mom. You okay? Tyrell's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up at her son. His teenage frame tall and lanky. His brown eyes filled with concern. Tyrell had inherited her resilience. But Elena knew he carried the same burdens, only now they were compounded by the world outside their door. I'm fine. Baby, she lied, giving him a tired smile. Just a long shift. Tyrell nodded but didn't press further. He knew better than anyone that some wounds were too deep for words. Darren Holt paced the length of his living room, anger simmering beneath his skin. Abigail sat quietly on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself. She killed him. Darren hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. That nurse, she let our son die. You don't know that. Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. It was an accident. No, Darren's voice was sharp, cutting her off. They think they can get away with this. But I won't let them. That same morning, Darren made a call to a lawyer, determined to sue both the hospital and Elena Parker. In his mind, the loss of his child was not just an accident, it was a deliberate act. And someone had to pay. Amanda Cross sipped her coffee as she flipped through the morning news. The headline caught her eye, nurse accused of negligence after baby dies in delivery room. She scanned the article, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. Moments later, her phone rang. It was the public defender's office. Amanda. We need you on a high-profile case. A nurse is being sued after a white supremacist demanded she stay away from his child, and the baby died. Amanda paused, her mind spinning. Sounds messy. It is, her colleague admitted. But it's an important one. You in? Amanda sighed, already knowing the answer. I'll take it. Elena sat at the kitchen table late that night, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. A letter from the hospital lay open before her, an official notice that she was being placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to hold back the tears. She wasn't just a nurse, this job was her life. Her purpose. Every child she had helped deliver. Every mother she had comforted, it all felt like it was slipping away. Tyrell emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes. "Mom? What's going on?" Elena forced a smile. "Nothing you need to worry about. Baby. Go back to bed." Tyrell gave her a long look but nodded. He was old enough to sense the gravity of the situation, even if she tried to shield him from it. When he returned to his room, Elena whispered a quiet prayer, hoping for strength, for herself, for Tyrell, and for whatever lay ahead. Darren sat across from his lawyer, William Bryant, a sharp-eyed man with years of experience taking on controversial cases. "We'll go after the hospital and the nurse," Bryant said, flipping through a folder. "We argue that they were negligent, and the nurse's absence caused your child's death." Darren clenched his jaw. "I don't just want compensation. I want people to know what happened. I want them to pay." Bryant smirked. "We'll make sure they do." Soon after, Darren appeared on a local news segment, delivering a carefully rehearsed speech about how a nurse failed to act in his family's darkest hour. His words were calculated, his anger palpable, and his face filled every television screen in town. In the days that followed, the media descended on Elena's apartment building. She couldn't leave without cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. Amanda Cross sat across from Elena in a cramped conference room at the public defender's office. She studied the nurse closely, noting the exhaustion etched into her face. "Elena, I need to be honest," Amanda began. "This case is going to be tough. The media is all over it. And Darren Holt is pushing hard for compensation and a guilty verdict." Elena's hands tightened around the edges of the chair. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was ordered to leave the room." Amanda nodded. "We'll make sure the jury hears that. But the hospital's records show gaps in documentation. And the other staff might not back you up." Elena met Amanda's gaze. "I don't care how hard it gets. I need the truth to come out, for me. For Tyrell. And for every nurse who'll come after me." Amanda gave a small, reassuring smile. "Then let's fight this." Tyrell slouched in his classroom chair, his hoodie pulled low over his head. The whispers had started as soon as the news about his mom hit the media. "Hey, Tyrell," a boy sneered from the back of the room. "Your mom really killed that kid?" Laughter erupted around him, and Tyrell's face burned with shame and anger. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. That afternoon, as he walked home, he kicked a loose stone down the sidewalk, wishing he could disappear. When he got to the apartment, Elena was sitting on the couch, looking lost in thought. "Mom," Tyrell said softly, "they're saying stuff about you at school." Elena's heart sank. "I know. Baby. I wish I could protect you from all this." Tyrell sat beside her. "I'll be okay. Just don't give up." "Mom." She smiled, grateful for his quiet strength. "I won't. I promise." Amanda spent late nights researching similar cases, poring over legal precedents, and preparing for trial. But something kept gnawing at her. She had always thought of herself as fair and unbiased. Yet, the more she spoke with Elena, the more she realized how blind she had been to the privileges she had always taken for granted. She recalled moments from her own life, times when she had been pulled over by the police but treated with kindness. When she had been given second chances without even asking for them. Those moments felt different now. Heavy with the understanding that Elena and Tyrell wouldn't be afforded the same grace. Amanda looked at herself in the mirror one evening, seeing a reflection that felt unfamiliar. She wasn't just fighting for Elena's innocence, she was fighting to understand herself and the society she lived in. As the trial approached, Darren found himself increasingly isolated. Abigail had grown distant, disturbed by the extremism Darren was feeding into. One evening, After another argument, Abigail packed a suitcase. I can't do this anymore. Darren. I can't live like this, filled with hate. Darren stared at her. Stunned. You're leaving me. I have to, she whispered. Tears in her eyes. I have to find a better way to live, for myself. And for the memory of our son. Darren watched helplessly as Abigail walked out the door, taking the last piece of warmth from his life with her. The courtroom was packed as the trial began, with reporters crammed into the back rows, their notepads ready. Elena sat beside Amanda, her heart pounding as the judge called the court to order. Darren's lawyer wasted no time painting Elena as a negligent nurse who failed to act when it mattered most. The Holt family trusted the hospital, Bryant said, pacing before the jury. But instead of compassion, they received indifference. Amanda rose for her opening statement. This case isn't just about a tragic loss, she began. It's about the choices that were forced on Elena Parker, and the systemic bias that influenced those choices. Elena's eyes met Amanda's, a flicker of hope stirring in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be long and grueling. But she wasn't walking it alone. The trial entered its second day, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Elena watched as the prosecutor, William Bryant, called his first witness, Dr. Lane, the attending physician from the night the baby died. Dr. Lane. Bryant began smoothly. Can you confirm that the nurse, Elena Parker, was present during the delivery? Yes. Initially, Dr. Lane replied. Bryant leaned closer. And did she remain with the baby after it was born? Dr. Lane shifted in his seat. No. Mr. Holt requested that Ms. Parker leave the room. And did Ms. Parker express any objections? Bryant asked, his tone sharpening. No, Dr. Lane admitted. She complied with my instructions. Bryant smiled thinly and turned toward the jury. No further questions. When Amanda rose for her cross-examination, her voice was calm but deliberate. Dr. Lane. Would it have been medically appropriate for Miss Parker to intervene if the baby had shown signs of distress after birth? Yes. Dr. Lane replied reluctantly. And was Miss Parker given permission to do so? Amanda pressed. No. She was told not to interact with the child. Amanda nodded. In other words, Miss Parker was put in an impossible position: obey orders or risk punishment. The jury murmured softly. And Amanda's heart lifted slightly. The truth was beginning to surface. When Darren Holt took the stand, he carried himself with the quiet fury of a man determined to make someone pay for his loss. His lawyer guided him through his testimony, painting him as a grieving father. I just wanted the best for my son, Darren said, his voice filled with emotion. I didn't want him treated by someone who didn't understand us. Amanda stood slowly, her eyes locked on Darren. Mr. Holt, she began. Do you believe that your son would still be alive if a white nurse had been in the room? Darren hesitated. I don't know. Maybe. Amanda took a step closer. Is it possible that, in your grief, you are blaming someone who wasn't responsible? Someone who followed orders from hospital management? Not out of negligence, but out of fear. Darren clenched his jaw. But Amanda saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time, the anger that had sustained him began to falter. After court adjourned for the day, Amanda and Elena sat together in a quiet room at the courthouse. Amanda leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident in her features. This case, Amanda whispered. It's changing me. Elena gave her a small, tired smile. How so? I used to think I wasn't part of the problem, Amanda admitted. But I see now, being silent, being blind to what you've gone through. That's part of the problem too. Elena reached across the table and squeezed Amanda's hand. We all have things to learn. Amanda. What matters is that you're trying. For a moment. They sat in silence. Two women from different worlds. Bound together by a shared fight for justice. The third day of the trial brought an unexpected witness to the stand, Marie Whitfield. A nurse who had worked closely with Elena. Marie hesitated as she faced the courtroom. But when she met Elena's gaze, she squared her shoulders. I've known Elena Parker for years. Marie began. Her voice steady. She's one of the most compassionate, skilled nurses I've ever worked with. Bryant jumped in, trying to undermine her testimony. Isn't it true, Nurse Whitfield, that Elena complied with the family's request to leave the room? Yes, Marie said. But she was ordered to do so by hospital management. Marie paused. Then added. If she had stayed, that baby might still be alive today. But she was given an order, one rooted in prejudice, not medical judgment. The room fell silent. Amanda shot Marie a grateful glance. The tide was finally beginning to turn. The jury deliberated for 2 long days. Elena spent those hours at home, pacing the floor of her apartment, while Tyrell sat quietly by her side, offering silent support. When the call finally came, Elena and Amanda hurried to the courthouse. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the judge entered and the jury filed in. The foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. In the case of Holt versus Parker, we find the defendant not guilty. Elena closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. Amanda placed a reassuring hand on her back as murmurs spread through the courtroom. Darren sat motionless, stunned by the verdict. Abigail, sitting at the back of the courtroom, gave a quiet sigh of relief. She had hoped for justice, not the kind her husband sought, but the kind that acknowledged truth over hatred. With the trial behind her, Elena returned to her work as a nurse, determined to make a difference. But this time, she didn't just care for patients, she advocated for change. She worked with hospital administrators to implement policies addressing unconscious bias and built mentorship programs for young nurses of color. Amanda, too, found herself changed. She left the public defender's office and started a nonprofit focused on legal advocacy, helping individuals facing systemic discrimination. Even Darren, though bitter at first, began attending support groups for grieving parents. He struggled with the loss of his child but found, slowly, that hatred could not bring healing. Years later, Elena stood at the podium of a healthcare equity summit, addressing an audience filled with nurses, doctors, and community leaders. Tyrell, now a young man pursuing a career in music, sat proudly in the front row. Justice isn't just about one case or one trial, Elena told the audience. It's about the choices we make every day, to listen, to learn, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Amanda, seated beside Tyrell, smiled. The journey had not been easy, but they had built something meaningful, something that would continue to grow long after they were gone. In the back of the room, Abigail and Darren sat quietly together. Their marriage had ended, but they had found a way to coexist, united by the love they still carried for their lost child. As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Elena knew the fight wasn't over. But she also knew that, with every act of kindness, every policy changed, and every life touched, the world moved a little closer to justice. And in that moment, hope felt within reach. The trial might have ended, but the consequences lingered. Though the court cleared Elena's name, the experience had marked her, and Darren Holt, forever. In the following months, Elena found it difficult to re-enter her old routine at the hospital. Some colleagues treated her with renewed respect, But others still harbored quiet resentment. Believing she had dragged the hospital into a public scandal. She didn't let it deter her. Instead, Elena focused her energy on a new purpose, helping the next generation of healthcare professionals understand the importance of equity and empathy. Her first initiative was a mentorship program. She met with younger nurses, many of them from underrepresented backgrounds, and created a safe space for them to talk about challenges they faced in their careers. She became not just a nurse, but a mentor, an advocate, and a role model. Months after the trial, Darren Holt found himself sitting in a church basement, surrounded by other grieving parents. He wasn't sure how he had ended up there, he only knew that anger alone couldn't sustain him anymore. He listened as other parents shared stories of loss. They spoke of guilt, regret, and the desperate search for someone to blame. As Darren listened, he began to see his own reflection in their stories. Slowly, painfully, he admitted to himself that his hatred hadn't saved his child, it had only isolated him further. One evening, he mustered the courage to speak in the group. "I lost my son," he began quietly. "And for a long time, I blamed someone who didn't deserve it. But it's time for me to let that go." The group leader nodded. "The first step to healing is forgiveness, of others. And of yourself." For the first time in years, Darren felt the faintest glimmer of peace. One rainy afternoon, Abigail knocked on the door of Elena's apartment. She stood there awkwardly, her hands clutching a small bouquet of flowers. "I'm sorry," Abigail whispered, her voice heavy with regret. "For everything. I should have spoken up when it mattered." Elena regarded her for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her in. "We all make mistakes," Elena said. "But what matters is that we learn from them." They sat together at the kitchen table, drinking tea as the rain tapped softly against the windows. In that quiet moment, two women, once separated by fear and prejudice, began to rebuild something fragile and new, understanding. The day of Tyrell's high school graduation arrived, bringing with it a flood of emotions for Elena. She sat in the auditorium, her heart swelling with pride as her son took the stage to deliver his speech as valedictorian. Tyrell adjusted the microphone and smiled at the audience. "This diploma isn't just mine," he said, his voice steady. "It belongs to my mom, who taught me that no matter how unfair life gets, you keep moving forward. It belongs to the people who stood by us when it felt like the world was against us." He paused, looking directly at his mother. "And it belongs to everyone fighting for a future where we can all walk through life without fear, without hate, and with the chance to be seen for who we truly are." The crowd erupted in applause. Elena wiped away tears, overwhelmed with pride and gratitude. Amanda Cross's career had taken a new direction after the trial. She left the public defender's office and launched a nonprofit focused on legal advocacy for marginalized communities. Inspired by Elena's resilience and Darren's slow transformation, Amanda dedicated herself to addressing unconscious bias in the justice system. Her new organization, Beyond Equality, worked closely with hospitals, schools, and law enforcement agencies to implement training programs that tackled systemic bias. The nonprofit became a force for change, and Amanda found purpose in her work like never before. One spring morning, Darren made the decision to visit the hospital where his son had died. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish, he only knew that he needed closure. He found Elena in the pediatric ward, sitting with a mother and her newborn. As he approached, she looked up, surprise flickering across her face. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Darren said, his voice low but sincere. "For blaming you. For everything." Elena studied him for a moment, then gave him a small, kind smile. "I forgive you," she said simply. It wasn't a grand moment of redemption, but it was enough. Darren nodded. relief softening the lines of his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his grief begin to lift. Years later, the Jefferson Macquarie Foundation, the nonprofit Amanda and Elena founded together, stood as a beacon of hope in the community. It provided scholarships to students from underrepresented backgrounds, organized healthcare equity workshops, and offered free legal services to those in need. At the foundation's annual gala, Tyrell stood beside his mother, now a young man making his mark in the world of music. Amanda joined them, smiling warmly as they reflected on how far they had come. "We've built something meaningful," Amanda said softly. Elena nodded. "And the best part is, we're just getting started." In the crowd, Darren and Abigail stood quietly together, no longer defined by the past but by the progress they had made. They weren't perfect, but they were trying, and that was enough. As the night drew to a close, the guests gathered for one final moment, a song written by Tyrell, inspired by his mother's strength. As the music filled the room, Elena closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. The journey had been long, filled with heartbreak and healing, but it had been worth every step. And as the song's final notes lingered in the air, Elena knew one thing for certain: hope had taken root. And it would continue to grow.